Thank you again, listeners to Radio Northern Beaches, for joining us here on Community Voices program on 88.7 and 90.3 FM and streaming live on www.rnb.org.au. I'm your host, Michael Lester. These stories that a society and a culture and a country choose to tell themselves and not to tell themselves often too are very important determinant in the image and identity that we have of ourselves and of our country and of our nation. And that's sort of a theme of our discussion here today on Community Voices. We're going to be discussing a long forgotten and perhaps never fully recognised history of Australia, personified in the story of one person in a movie that we'll be discussing. It's fair to observe that Aboriginals here in Australia were diggers and soldiers in the First World War, and although they weren't even citizens and not entitled to vote, of course, and or any other rights really, they volunteered in big numbers, and by some counts over 1,000 of them participated in the First World War and fought over there in Europe, and many died and were prisoners. And of course, when they got back home, they weren't particularly well treated either, to put it mildly, and it took a long struggle for them to get any rights and recognition, and that struggle continues to this day. For those stories to be told and the truth to be told, as I say, today we're going to be discussing the life story and biography of one of these soldiers, a very remarkable gentleman by the name of Douglas Grant, who lived between 1885 and 1951 and fought in the First World War. And we're going to be doing this in discussion with our guest today, who is Professor Tom Murray, Professor of Screen Art, Macquarie University, an Australian Research Fellow of the Future. He's been working for 20 years or more, crafting stories of the cultural and cross-cultural history of Australia in film. He's done 4 films, but also books and in his research. Tom is joining us from up in the Northern Territory in Arnhem Land, actually, and we're going to be discussing the movie that he's made. It's called The Skin of Others. It's about a 90-minute docudrama, and it's going to be playing here on the Northern Beaches at the Mona Vale Memorial Hall on the 11th of November at 7:30 p.m. in the evening, no reservations required, presented there by the Aboriginal support group of Manly, Warringah and Pittwater. So I'd like to thank you very much, Tom, for taking the trouble to join us all the way from Arnhem Land by, I guess, satellite link.
Thanks for the introduction, Michael. Lovely to be with you, lovely to be with your listeners. And yes, as I look out from where I am currently, I'm looking over the tranquil waters at the moment of Blue Mud Bay in northeast Arnhem Land, which is from a community called Bunnyella, which is most famous these days as being the home of sea rights. So we all know about the land rights case that started with Eddie Mabo. Mm-hmm. Well, here in Bunnyella, they established that Aboriginal people have custodianship and rights over sea country. And it was a case that was brought here in Bunnyella that went to the court and established those rights.
Well, thanks for that. The bylines, I think, in the promotions for your film say something along the lines of a forgotten man, a hidden national history, and a bridge. By way of opening, I believe it took you some 10 years to put this movie together. What initially prompted your interest in trying to tell this story?
I started around about 2010, and what I realized at that point was that 4 years from then, 10 years ago now, 4 years from then, we're going to be celebrating, memorializing, thinking about the beginnings of the First World War, which happened in 1914. And I thought that as we, as a nation, start to reflect on what that war meant, and, there's been huge legacy today in the form of Anzac, but what that war really meant, I thought there's going to be a few things that our national memorializing probably isn't going to cover very well. And one of those might have been the service of women across many nations, and certainly, as you said in your introduction, the service of Aboriginal people. Now, we know now that roughly around about 1,500, perhaps more, Aboriginal men served in the First World War. And it was problematic to do so because as an Aboriginal person, you weren't allowed to sign up. And so people had to find all sorts of imaginative ways in which to be able to sign up and fight for whatever reason people wanted to fight for at that point.
Now, as I say, the central focus of your film, I understand, is Douglas Grant, who I mentioned in the introduction. I believe that he was born in the times of the frontier wars and had a pretty rough introduction to life and society and culture and went on there. Could you give us a brief sketch of his origins and the trajectory that found him participating in the First World War?
Sure. One of the things that I think is really remarkable about Douglas Grant's life and why in some of the press materials, I think even in the text of the film, we say that he has some kind of similarities to a kind of Forrest Gump character, is that all of these truly significant nation-defining moments in Australian history can be linked in some ways, curious ways, back to Douglas Grant. So, as you just said, he was born in 1885, and he was born in the rainforest nations of far north Queensland. So the tablelands that are now called the Atherton Tablelands, but were the home of many Aboriginal clans, the Jurubal, Yidinji, Najon peoples, and others. They all made homes. They lived their life in those rainforest areas. And it wasn't until the 1880s and the discovery of gold in some of those places that the settler colonial society was interested in those places. And then there became a mini gold rush. And part of that gold rush was that people felt insecure about Aboriginal presences there. And there was raging across Australia from at least the 1840s. There was a group that were known as the Mounted Police. Now, these were soldiers who were fighting on behalf of the state, and they were usually regiments of Aboriginal people, mostly Aboriginal people from other parts of Australia, not the parts of Australia they were being deployed in, and they were being led by white Australian commanders. And these were a really devastating force. And as you kind of will see in the film, there's a few examples of how the Mounted Police operated. But in the case of Douglas Grant's family, you had a family living in rainforest country in which they'd lived for, let's say, 15, 20, 25,000 years. Occupation goes further back than that. But say that those families had lived there for a really seriously long period of time. And one morning, the Mounted Police decided to attack and raid their camp. Many people were killed in this massacre. And according to the adoptive parents of Douglas Grant, his own parents were killed in that massacre. So a white couple who were working for the Australian Museum, who were collecting artifacts for the museum at that time, 1885, 1886, found, so they say, Douglas Grant orphaned on the battlefield and decided to adopt him. He was a child of maybe 2 years old at the time. So Douglas got brought down to Sydney, to first to Lithgow, which was a Scottish enclave, and then to Annandale, which also has a good Scottish name. So that was Annandale in Sydney, was also a Scottish enclave. So he grew up there in Annandale in Sydney.
And how did he make his way into volunteering to be a digger in the First World War?
So he grew up in this family that were, as I said, Scottish, Robert and Elizabeth Grant, good Scottish, Southern Scottish names. And they must have, instilled in him, in fact, we know he did, like a sense, a work ethic and a sense of duty to the Crown. And he was encultured in many ways into the Scottish culture of his parents. He loved the poetry of Robbie Burns. He sang Scottish songs and religious hymns. And so I think that from that upbringing, it wasn't any surprise that he felt a certain amount of patriotism, like a lot of other people of the time. Obviously, a lot of other white people fighting for empire, but also Aboriginal people. And he felt that sense of duty. And so he was working as a wool classer at a sheep farm that was owned by Patrick White, the writer's family, near Scone. And from Belltrees, which was the name of the property, he went along to the local registry and signed up. Now, how he came to be allowed to sign up, given obviously he was a full black Aboriginal man, so there was no hiding his Aboriginality, but he spoke very good English. He, I think, for all intents and purposes, he was seen as in a similar way to a lot of the other white young men who were enlisting at that point. So from there, he decided to enlist.
That is an intriguing dimension, that a black man should be motivated to fight for people who didn't even recognize him as a citizen and didn't actually, I understand, they didn't actually even have a legal right, did they, for a while to actually even be in the services. But leaving that aside, he took off with many of the other black diggers and Aboriginal soldiers, and they fought in the European theatres in France and Bullecourt, and he fought and he was captured and he was a POW and he was in a camp, and he developed a remarkable sort of role within that POW community, didn't he? He wasn't just another prisoner. He was a bit of a sort of a leader of people and bringing people together, or?
That's right, Michael. He was a really intelligent man, highly literate. What happened was that he became head of the British Help Committee in a prisoner of war camp just outside of Berlin. Now, this war camp became particularly famous, and in the film I go and visit it, and it's famous in Germany as the site of Germany's first mosque. And this is because part of the German Secret Service, the intelligence service, had decided that they were going to infiltrate the soldiers who fought for the British, French, for the Allies, who'd come from across the world, and try to infiltrate this and teach them that the Germans would be a much better colonial master and that they should fight for the Germans instead of the Allies. And so Douglas Grant ends up in this camp along with a whole lot of other captured British subjects, Sikhs and Hindus from India, French troops from Senegal and Ivory Coast, and Gurkhas from Nepal, Maori soldiers. So basically the peoples of the world, and that's why Douglas Grant was sent there, were held in this prisoner of war camp. One, because the Germans were having this, and they actually called it a jihad, which has obviously got different connotations these days, but they were trying to facilitate a jihad against the British in occupied territories. And the second part of the grand strategy of this very, very curious prisoner of war camp was that they made it a site for anthropology and linguistics. So all these scholars working in all these universities across Germany who were sitting on their hands because it was a war and they couldn't do their usual study, decided they were going to study these soldiers from all over the world, study their languages, study their music and culture and ways. And a couple of the anthropologists said it was much easier than having to, study Samoans in Samoa where they might get speared, because here they had these very kind of, in their thoughts, sort of docile and held soldiers inside of a prisoner of war camp, so they could study them. And one person said it was like it was this huge kind of anthropological zoo, is what they considered it as. So Douglas Grant ends up in this very, very curious place just outside of Berlin.
Our guest here on Community Radio Northern Beach is Professor Tom Murray, and we're discussing a movie that he's made, a docudrama that honours Aboriginal diggers and the forgotten story of, really, and perhaps not properly acknowledged story of their participation in World War I, in the form of a bio of Douglas Grant, whom we're discussing. This movie, docudrama, is going to be shown at the Mona Vale Memorial Hall on the 11th of November in the evening, 7:30, and it's being promoted there, and it's free. You don't need to register, just turn up, by the Aboriginal support group of Mani Warringah and Pittwater. Our guest, Tom Murray, has written, directed and produced this movie. This movie you've called, or is titled, The Skin of Others. What's the significance of this title?
Thanks for that question, Michael. It's because it does cut to something that's key to the film, and that's the sense in which, and I've just been describing how all these peoples were held in this prisoner of war camp where they were seen as other to the Germans. They were seen as people worthy of being studied but not given full humanity in the sense that Germans saw themselves. This battle for the world's others, the colonized others of the world, to be recognized fully in their humanity is an ongoing one, as you mentioned in your introduction. And this certainly was a big challenge for Douglas Grant, because here he was encultured into a British heritage, into a specifically Scottish heritage, growing up in Annandale amongst a whole bunch of people who he would consider his uncles and aunties, and he had a younger brother, adoptive brother. And so he would have seen himself very much as a person of that heritage, but yet he had totally black skin. And by his black skin, he was judged by people who didn't know him. And by that judgment, he was deemed to be less than they were. And this is a big challenge that we face to the present day. People have a whole lot of judgment based on quite superficial characteristics such as skin color. And at the very beginning of the film, the great actor, Alain Tommy Lewis, who plays Douglas Grant, he notes that people often judge the book by its cover. They don't often, he says, in the film, spend time to open the book and read what's inside. So that was the kind of the rationale for the title. It was about judgment, the process of othering that is ongoing.
Those judgments really seem to come to book after he comes back from doing his military service and POW time in support of his country and his fellow Australians, so to speak. And he has a very, very tough time of it, doesn't he? He comes back and essentially he can't find any work. He has a mental breakdown. He basically spends his time at Callan Park for nearly a decade in the 30s. And then he moves through to Lithgow, which you mentioned from his earlier life. But he becomes involved in radio, I believe, and he becomes a little bit of an activist, or maybe quite a significant activist as a journalist, and start going out there trying to, speak against the racial divide, does he?
Yes, the more I got to know him as I was making the film, the more I admired him. I think he was an incredibly impressive man. So he's just experienced the full horrors of the First World War. And we know how many men, white, black, whatever color you were, so many men came back and suffered what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, shell shock back in the day. Just the trauma that they witnessed, and Douglas Grant being there at the Battle of Bullecourt, which so many Australians lost their lives, would have been a pretty horrendous experience. So he comes back to Australia, and he comes back to a nation where he thinks, having served for his country, he will get additional respect. And this was the case with many Aboriginal men coming back. One of the reasons that Aboriginal people, to answer the question that you posed a lot earlier, why they fought for Australia, is that they thought that having fought for Australia, their rights would be better under the nation state of Australia. They might be able to have access to their land and country, which had been theirs through historical lineage to the present. But actually, that wasn't the case. Totally in an opposite fashion, many men came back to find their wives and children having been taken away to missions and other places, and their lands lost. So Douglas Grant came back to a country that was more iniquitous than the one that he left in many ways. And so, yes, he became an activist. He wrote for newspapers because, as I said, he was highly literate and a great writer. So he wrote for various newspapers, and he was quite a celebrity through the 1920s. He went to a rugby game out in Western New South Wales, somewhere near Junee, I think, in sheep country out there. And he noticed that there was an Aboriginal team that the white team refused to play. So he wrote an article about that, the colour line. He said, in the war, the colour line was never drawn. I was allowed, along with other black soldiers, to fight for this country. And now I come back to this place, and Aboriginal people are not even allowed to play football. So he wrote about that kind of stuff. And there was a really terrible massacre of Aboriginal people by a World War I veteran at a place called Coniston in the Northern Territory. And many, many people died there. And Douglas Grant rightly thought that was an outrage. And he wrote about that. So he was a big activist. But I think that one of the things was that it was very dangerous to be, still is, dangerous to be an Aboriginal person being a very public activist about these things. And at that point, the police and others were paying attention to him. And along with the stress that he had from serving in the war, I think it all just became too much for him. So as you explained earlier, he did end up at Callan Park. He ended up in Ward 2, I think it is, Ward B, which was for the returned soldiers, the prisoners, the returned soldiers that were suffering from their war-inflicted psychological injuries. So he was there for around about 10 years. And then Northern Beaches people will be interested because one of his colleagues from the war lived in DY. And so Douglas Grant spent a lot of time down there just near DY Beach, hanging out with that family. And they used to cruise up and down, and just on Narrabeen Lake there was a pub that they used to go to. So, Douglas Grant leaves his trail across the Northern Beaches, but he did have a radio show in Lithgow. Because he was head of the Returned Soldiers League in Lithgow for a while. So he had a radio show up there, the Diggers Show. He was a remarkable, multi-talented man, and he withstood many of life's slings and bows and arrows, as the saying goes.
Well, indeed, he does. As I mentioned earlier, one of the bylines promoting your movie that we're discussing, The Skin of Others, speaks of him as a bridge to the future. But you've also made the point that trying to be a cultural bridge builder then, and I guess still now, I think you described it as extremely dangerous, trying to be an Aboriginal man seeking, and I think the word here is reconciliation across the racial divide that we know exists here. So what moral, in a sense, are we to draw from this story, given that at the end of the day, he felt so badly treated and ignored in Anzac Day celebrations and everything up, he ended up towards the end of his life saying, I'm not wanted anymore.
I know, and isn't that tragic? Like, what a tragic sentiment. Yeah, that one, Michael, is a really big question. I think you kind of nodded towards it at the beginning and talking about the way that we build stories of our nationhood. And one of the theses that's kind of buried within the film is that across these two wars, two wars that Douglas Grant sort of survived, which was the frontier wars that his parents were killed in, which has it's still challenging for people to appreciate that there were wars right across Australia. I mean, I went to Harbour Primary School there on the northern beaches, and we didn't learn about any of that stuff at school. We didn't hear that there was wars on Aboriginal people at that point, but there was, and there's enough evidence. It's all very clear, and that's one of the things that Aboriginal people have been calling for quite a long time. It was part of the Uluru Statement that we need to grapple with the truth of our history. So in the Uluru Statement, they call for national truth-telling. So this film is trying to provide a forum for some of the truths, the hard truths of this nation. It wasn't the case, as some of the kids up there on the Atherton tableland believe, that Aboriginal people, along with Italians and other migrants to the area, were people that came later, and the settlers were the first people. There's been all sorts of kind of strange kind of myths that have grown across Australia that Aboriginal people kind of melted away or peacefully drifted to the periphery, when actually it was very concerted military conflicts that served to kill Aboriginal people and also to the morale of Aboriginal people. And, it was a concerted military strategy. So truth-telling is one very important thing that can be drawn from the film and drawn from what Aboriginal people have stated that they would like. And obviously a longer term is the call for some kind of formal treaty. So there's treaty in New Zealand, as we know, and there's treaties in other jurisdictions, but Australia's never really had a treaty to acknowledge that Aboriginal people were the first people of the country. And that's going to be significant, not just for its symbolism, but just because it allows a forum then to talk through our difficult history and actually come through it together. Because the important thing is not to disenfranchise settlers. My family came to Australia in 1972, 73, and I'm a first generation migrant to Australia. It's not to say that we can't live in Australia, that we have no place. It's actually just to acknowledge the history that has happened in Australia and then to come to a more just recognition of what that should mean. And for a lot of people, that conversation is just too challenging. And there was all sorts of politics that happened around the Voice recent referendum. But ultimately, we're going to have to, as a nation, become a little bit more mature in order to have the conversations that we need to have.
Yes, our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches is Tom Murray, who's a Professor of Screen Arts at Macquarie University, and we're discussing the movie that he's written, directed and produced, which is showing at Mona Vale Memorial Hall on the 11th of November in the evening. It's called The Skin of Others, and it's a movie in honour of Aboriginal diggers, and particularly their service in WW1, World War One, and particularly through the story of Douglas Grant, 1885 to 1951. In the wake of the very tragic, I might say, rejection of the Voice, we're left, as you say, presumably trying to pursue some degree of truth-telling as we move forward. One of the actor who plays Douglas Grant, he too himself has an interesting story, doesn't he? It's Tom Lewis, and from his very first film where he played Jimmy Blacksmith in Keneally's book Child of Jimmy Blacksmith, he's had a very stellar career in movies, and he plays Douglas Grant, but he too, I guess, has his own stories. He's an advocate himself for Aboriginal reconciliation, and I think you talk about, and he does, bringing people back to the same campfire through storytelling. Is this a realistic aspiration given the rejection of the Voice?
Well, here I am in Northeast Arnhem Land, and one of the things that is very, very clear as I'm living in a homeland that has phenomenal amount of culture, that we're lucky enough, the young people in this particular area, to have resisted the earliest and most devastating impacts of colonialism, that people survived, and they survived in their own country with their own stories. And one thing that becomes apparent is that Aboriginal people are the most generous and persistent proselytizers of what needs to happen in this country. And what needs to happen is that we come together to appreciate the history of this country with all of its trauma, all of its challenges, and all of its heroism, all of the good and the bad that's happened in this country, and actually come to terms with it in order to tell a different story for this country. And one thing that's quite profound, I think, that Archie Roach, who's also in the film, dear old Uncle Archie Roach, he says that we need to develop a story for this country that we are all authors of. That's his quote. And I think that's really profound. So Aboriginal people haven't stopped inviting us to these conversations. And, they are the ones that can invite us, being the first peoples of this country. And they haven't stopped. They're saying, okay, the voice, as depressing as that might be for many people to have had that voted down, and what it says potentially, Aboriginal people haven't stopped. They haven't said, okay, well, that's it, we're not going to bother. On the whole, people are like, okay, well, what next?
In our conversation with Tom Murray about the movie that we're discussing, The Skin of Others, honouring Indigenous Aboriginal diggers, particularly in participation in World War One, in the biopic about Douglas Grant, one of your bylines that I mentioned earlier too for the film is a forgotten man and a hidden national history. I'd like to ask you about making this film, because it's never easy to make and finance a film in Australia and get it distributed commercially. I'm talking just raising money, and it takes a lot of money to make a 90-minute film of the sort that you're making, and caliber and quality and all the research. How difficult or easy was it to find financing and distribution to get this truth-telling out there?
It's always challenging to get finances for films. It's part of the general thrust of our culture, unfortunately, that our national culture is not being funded in the way it was even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 years ago. I made my first film in this community where I am right now 20 years ago through something called the National Interest Program, which was to make culture that was in the national interest. Those kind of things don't happen anymore. So this film was made largely through funds from the Australian Research Council. Within universities, there is such a thing that funds major research across all of the sciences and the humanities. And so the Australian Research Council funded most of this film. I also have funds from Screen Australia and some other funding bodies, because films are expensive, as you say. But it's getting more and more challenging to make serious work that really wants to get under the cover and through the pages of our national story.
Financing is one thing, but to ask you about distribution, because without distribution, you can't get the story out. But there must be a challenge to get a movie like this distributed to big audiences, is there? And how are you tackling that?
This is distributed through Ronan, and Ronan, a really wonderful organisation. Andrew Pike and his colleagues there, I think they did Strictly Ballroom many years ago. They've been making really iconic, seriously important Australian films for a very long time. And so based on the quality of this work, Ronan were very happy to distribute it. And it went to a bunch of film festivals that premiered at the Sydney Film Festival. Distribution is possible when you have a work of very high quality. The challenge, as you noted before, is actually getting the funds to make something of high quality.
You've got a good distributor, but it fundamentally will come back to the question of, do people want to hear these stories, and then will they pay to go along and hear this truth-telling? And I might leave this discussion on that provocative question in the wake of the rejection of the Voice referendum. Our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches has been Tom Murray, Professor at Macquarie University of Screen Arts, writer, producer and director of The Skin of Others, a film honouring the Aboriginal diggers' participation in World War One, and will be screening for free at the Mona Vale Memorial Hall on the Beaches on the 11th of November in the evening. No registrations necessary. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and all the best with the film.
Thanks, Michael. And just to finish then, like the yawl here, I think you've got to maintain hope. Relentless hope will get you a long way. There's no point giving up. So carry on.
Indeed. Thank you very much.